Hi, I'm Trevor Blumenau, CEO of Voodoo Robotics. I wanted to give you a little demonstration of our big block server today. You can see on the screen here, we'll start with a login screen, and basically this is an account that we've created on our demo big block server. The T Blumenau account, as you'll see in a moment, is a manager type of account, and I've set up my username and password. So we just sign in over here. And typically when you log in, you're presented with the devices page. As I said, this is our server at Voodoo Robotics that we use for demonstration purposes and for testing. And so we have quite a number of devices in here. Not all of them are assigned to a location. But let's go through each of these different menus at the top over here. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these pages and what they're designed for, what they're used for, what you can expect to see on these pages. So starting with the devices page, the first thing, and this is probably the most overlooked thing, is this little menu in the top right here. You've got this little show button with a pull down arrow, and if you pull that down, you can actually specify what columns you want to view on this page. And so, if you turn on all of these different columns, it starts to get a little bit crowded. But let's turn them all on so that we can talk about what they all mean. You don't need to turn them all on, obviously, but just for the purposes of this demo, we'll turn them all on so that I can talk about them. And of course, you've got the CSV button here. This is for extracting comma-separated values of the data that you see in front of you in order to play with it in Excel, maybe modify it, that kind of thing. So don't overlook this menu over here. Now, the search bar over here on the left side, you can actually just start to type in, like you can see over here, I've got this device C00361. If I just type in the first letter C, you'll see that it's actually limiting down all the devices that start with a C. And if I put in a C0, it's actually limiting, well, you can't really see here. Let's put in C1. If I put in C1, you can see it's going to limit down all the devices that start with C1, and you can see that there are 86 of them right now. If we go back to C0, you'll see this device that we saw at the top, and then you can further limit it. Let's say we're just going to type in 361, which is part of this device number here. Say 361. You can see that this device, is still kept in the list, but this one also has a 361 in it. This has 361 at the end. So in other words, you can just type in any part of a device ID over here, and you'll see that device listed. You don't have to type in the whole device. And this is a philosophy that we have at Voodoo. We never want you to type in a whole device ID. It's confusing to type in, 12 characters. Invariably you miss a character or something. So we try to make it so that all of these fields are scannable with a barcode scanner. You could certainly scan in, a device ID off of a device right here, to find that device, or just type in the first few characters and it should appear. Okay, so let's remove that, and just to show you the full number of devices here, you can scroll down, obviously, to all the different devices. Let's click on a particular device. This device, let's see, is in Aaron's office. And you can see in here, now, on this server, we'll talk about it in a minute, but we have the temperature information disabled right now. So just a little heads up that we do support temperature, and you can look at temperature information and set alarms and things like that in the screen, but that's currently disabled, and so that's not going to be part of this demonstration. But you can see here that we have, of course, the device ID is grayed out. You can't change that once you're looking at a particular device ID. You have the display timeout. That's the number of seconds, if you go up and you push the button on the device, how long that device is going to be displayed for. How long the light is going to be on with that particular display on that device, and then it's going to flip back to your static messages if you have a static message. The brightness is the brightness of the LED. 50% is a reasonable number. In very dim warehouses, you may be able to reduce this a little bit and save a little bit of power, or in a brightly lit environment, you probably want to make this a little bit higher, make the light stand out a little bit more. And then of course you have an area and location that you can specify here. If you do have an area, you got to separate it out, and we've got videos about this, how to set these values, but essentially you would put your area first with a pipe separator and then a location if you do have an area. This device is showing me that it's last updated in our database 11 minutes ago, fairly recent. Devices should update every 60 minutes if they're working correctly and they're in range of a turbo. So you shouldn't see a number that's greater than 60 over here. And then of course you can set your static messages directly over here for that particular device. It's really not something that we would expect you to do on this page. You certainly can, and you can certainly inspect what the static messages are for this device, but really you'd probably on a working system be setting the static messages and sending the commands via your REST API. But you do have access to try things out here. So for example, you could put in, I have IC top over here. So this is an icon that points to the top. So it's, if you set that as your static message, you're going to see a little upward arrow on your device. And we have another video, I'll link to it down below, on all the variations of, different things like barcodes that you can set, and hazard icons, all sorts of crazy things like that. In the right column here, you've got the number of hours that this device has been running. It's been running for 556 hours. That's pretty good. Sometimes when you see a 0 here, it's because you just changed the batteries, but other times, it might be a device that's not actually working so well. Maybe it's resetting itself. And so this is definitely something that is worth checking. Shows you the firmware that we're running on this device as of this video. Version 60 is the latest. And then of course, this is the voltage on the device that was last reported 11 minutes ago. It's a very good voltage, 3.02. Is a very good voltage for a device. Normally, when you put brand new batteries in at maybe 3.1, 3.15, something like that, it'll drop all the way down, voltage anywhere down to 2.7, 2.6, even 2.5 is pretty good voltage. We normally set our thresholds for changing batteries at about 2.3 volts, and we'll see and later in this video where you can actually set that threshold. And this is the signal strength to the closest turbo is a minus 50 dBm. That's very good. We'll communicate with the device all the way down to minus 80 dBm. And so minus 50 is excellent. This device is probably very, very close to this turbo right here, probably within a few feet. So very good numbers there. Okay, so let's look at the voltage tab here for this particular device. If I click on the voltage tab, you can actually see a graph over time of the voltage on this device. And you can see this device hasn't been used that much, and so it's sort of been drifting down. Started at about 3.11 over here, and then it's finishing down here at about 3.02 recently, and you can see the timeline down here on the bottom. If you want to zoom into one of these graphs, you just left click and drag, and it'll show you that particular sequence of data. Very nice. You can also take a snapshot of that particular graph. You can, well, zoom in, I showed you. You can pan over. You can also zoom out or switch back to the home view again, which is where we started. And you can toggle some things over here. You can actually export the data that's generating this graph in a CSV format as well. Can be very useful. And there's several graphs here. So let's look at the next graph, is the LAN latency. Now, this particular device doesn't show much LAN latency because we're not communicating with it. Actually, we'll come back to these LAN latency, OTA latency, total latency, and RSSI graphs. These are not active right now because this device is not really being communicated with a lot. But just to summarize, LAN latency is the amount of time that any command takes over your LAN. So if you're sending a command to a device, there's a portion of that latency that is, the wired latency on your LAN, and then there's a portion that's over the air between the turbo and the device. And so we break those down into two different parts for you to analyze here. You can look at the wired part and the over-the-air part, and then the total is just the sum of those two. And then the RSSI is the signal strength for the communication, when that communication occurred, how strong was the signal at that time, and which turbo completed the communication. We'll come back to these graphs in a little bit. You'll see in a little while. Let's go back to the devices page and just talk about these various columns. Again, this is the location that you saw that we set. So let's just go back just to emphasize that again. Let's say we want to actually change this, as we talked about, and we're going to put in IL3 and then save that change. So you can see here the device now shows the new location over here, and in fact the search bar is actually doing double duty. You can actually go in here and look for a device in a particular location. So if we type in AAR, you can see it's keying in on this AAR of Aaron's device. Now the RSSI we talked about, signal strength, the closest turbo, we saw that on the page when we clicked on the device, the voltage information as well, the updated time. Now this is the one thing that you may not know about. There are devices actually. Let's look at what a device looks like that's not authorized, because that'll be interesting. If we go in here, let's just find one that's not authorized in our list. Well, we can actually click on a column table to sort, but not on the authorized table. So there was one. Oh, I'm struggling to find one here. There's one. Okay, so let's click on this one. If you click on a device that's not authorized, you can see here it says the server is not authorized to communicate with this device. What that means is that this device is not in your account. And so we actually at Voodoo Robotics have to allocate a particular device to your account in order for you to use it, either in Scootkeeper or in Big Block. And so this error message is actually telling us that we cannot communicate with this device because it's not owned by your account. So if you do see this message, you can contact us. If it is a device that is owned by you, we can transfer it into your account and make sure that it's usable to you. But I wanted you to see this little message that may come up here from time to time if a device is not authorized. And of course, you will see it in this last column only, again, if that column is shown. And so normally, when you log in, if you open a new tab, let's say, let's open a new tab over here, you can see that normally we only show device ID, location, voltage, and updated. So you'd have to actually turn on that authorized column to see those values. So that gives you a little idea of the devices page. This is pretty important down here when you're first setting up your system, is this fast location assignments. Don't overlook this feature. Very, very useful, because if you simply take your devices and place them on your racks or on your carts in the locations that you want them, and maybe next to them you have, let's say, a barcode that represents that particular location name, you can do a very fast assignment of device to location name. And you do that by clicking on this button over here, and what happens is you can then use a scanner and scan the device ID of the device, and then simply scan the location, bang, bang, and that'll automatically hit the save button for you right here, and you will save the location information for that device ID. Now the area thing is kind of interesting. You could, for example, say aisle 3 over here, and then scan the device ID and scan the location, and what that'll do is it'll save that aisle name and the location for that device ID, and then come back to the screen and still maintain this area information. So that way on a cart, let's say, you could go through bang, 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 and you'll get all of those, if you set cart 3, or cart 4, let's say, all of those will be assigned the area for cart 4. So very, very useful tool here for setting up locations very, very quickly when you first install your system. You don't have to type in device IDs. We don't want you to type in device IDs. We don't want you to, get something wrong there or type in the wrong location number or something like that. So very, very useful screen over here. Okay, let's go on to the turbo screen. In the turbo screen, you can see we've got quite a few turbos over here. Normally you wouldn't have this many turbos with this much chaos in your system. But we do a lot of testing over here. If you look again, I want to point out this menu on the right side again has, different things that you can disable and enable for your particular turbo. So don't overlook this menu. You can turn on all sorts of interesting information. We'll turn them all on so that we can go through them over here. Again, you've got the CSV export, so you can export this into your spreadsheet. And if you're looking for a particular turbo, let's see, this one has a 33B in it. You can key down on that particular turbo. And then you've got all sorts of information here. Let's start out by just clicking on this turbo and going into it. You can actually see here. Now, one of the things that we really recommend is for you to specify a location of a turbo. So whenever you are installing a turbo into your system and you enter the credentials and stuff, come into the system over here and add location, because if you put all your turbos up on the wall, for example, it's not really readily apparent, after you mount the turbo, like which turbo is which. So if you put a location identifier here, then you know that a particular turbo is on this particular column in your warehouse, for example, that kind of thing. And so that's a very worthwhile label for you to add for your turbo. Everything else on the screen you can see is all grayed out. You can't change anything on the screen, but it does give you a lot of information about a particular turbo. And in this case, it's telling us the IP address. This is the preferred IP address, actually. Your turbo might actually have two IP addresses, one for Wi-Fi and one for Ethernet. And it's going to prefer an Ethernet IP address. And so if you do have an Ethernet IP address, it'll be reflected here. Otherwise, it'll just use the Wi-Fi. And then notice also, it's got, for example, the Wi-Fi signal strength. This one is connected by Wi-Fi, and it's showing you the signal strength of your Wi-Fi connection. This is a measure of the radio environment, how many devices or how crowded the communication signals are for our devices. This is a value between 0 and 1. This actually is the internal temperature of the turbo. So, if your turbos are overheating, this really shouldn't get above 75 degrees Celsius. We very rarely see it even get above, 55, 60 degrees Celsius. So it tells you how long your turbo's been running, the revision that's running on that turbo, the radio that's running on it. This actually, you can see this turbo has not been seen for 331 days. So a turbo should always check in about every 2 minutes. So this is a really old turbo. It has not been seen on this machine for a long time. Let's go in here and we'll find some more recent turbos. And of course, again, you can click on the sort, right? So, I can click on the updated signal arrow here, and this will show you that, these are the really old turbos. If I click on that again, it's going to show you the very recent ones that have just checked in. So for example, this one is on Mike's desk, and if I click on this turbo, you can see much more recent data, 48 seconds ago, and of course it's running a much later firmware. At the time of this video, this is the latest firmware, is 5.9, with the latest radio revision. It's an RT radio. This again, like before, has graphs for the latency, and here you can see actually a little bit more latency information, and you can see here, so for example, here's some information about communication. You can see that this is in milliseconds, so this is thousands of a second. So this top line here is 4 seconds, this is 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, and you can see, so for example, if you want to zoom in on this area, we can look at this particular case, and you can see here was one communication took 0.162 seconds, less than 2/10 of a second. This one was less than half a second. This one was more than a second, close to 2 seconds, and then this one was about half a second over here. So you can actually look at the different LAN communication times over here. Now, what's more interesting to me, actually, and the thing that we really focus on, is the over-the-air latency, which is actually the amount of time that it takes between the turbo and the device for a communication. So let's zoom in, for example, to this set of communications. So here, you can actually see here, we had one communication, it was half a second from the turbo to the device. This one was 0.3 seconds. This one was 0.8 seconds. These are actually very good numbers. Normally we expect, less than about 1.2 seconds is very typical for the communication between a turbo and a device that's properly oriented. And then, of course, the total latency is the sum of the LAN latency and the over-the-air latency, and you can see those numbers here. And then the relative signal strength indicator over here, you can actually see, for this device, for this turbo, these are some of the communications that it had. Let's zoom into this section over here. You can see when it was talking to this device, E8DD49, it had a signal strength of minus 50 dBm. When it was communicating to this device, F8AA6D, it had a signal strength of minus 50 dBm. So diagnosing communications here can be very, very useful using these values over here. Okay, so you can see what these different things are over here. Let's just go back to the turbo screen. Now, the other thing that's very useful is you can actually click on a particular IP address over here, and you can actually make a web request over your LAN to that particular device. Now, in this case, we're not actually connected over the LAN here to this device, and so this communication is going to fail. But there is very useful diagnostic information on your LAN if you click on the IP address, and you can actually see, the communication diagnostics between a particular turbo and the devices around it. So here we just got a bad gateway error, and that's because of the security. We in general, if we're not within the firewall, the same firewall of these turbos, you're not going to be able to see the diagnostics. Okay, so let's continue on. That's the turbos page. The sequencing page, or the sequences page, I'm going to make a separate video about sequencing, but just to give you a quick overview, you can import sequences here, you can view your unstarted sequences, you can launch a sequence here, you can view your started sequences and look at all the completed sequences here. And again, you've got this menu here which you can enable and disable different views of different things, similar to what you see on the devices and turbo screen. And as I say, I'm going to come back and I'm going to do a whole nother video on sequencing using Big Block, the implications of it, what it's used for. Just as a summary, you can set a sequence on Big Block of several commands that you want to occur in sequence, in series, one after the other, or maybe you want two to complete and then a third one to go after that. So you can set up these structures within Big Block, and we'll talk about that in the other video. I'll link to it in the comments below. Okay, let's talk about these three tabs: completed, timed out, and lost. These are very important tabs over here. These three tabs are very closely related. If you send a device, so let's take a particular device, and we're just going to choose a device, let's say one that was recently communicated with. You can see this one 32 minutes ago. Let's go into this device, and I'm just going to send it an identify message right here. Okay, if we go into the lost page, you're going to see that command right there. We just did it. It's now 10:54 in the morning. You're going to see that particular command is listed on the lost page. And note down here it says this list might include all commands still pending on devices. When I send the identify command to a device, it actually it's pending on the device for 20 seconds. That's what a typical lost command does. Now, your command may be longer than that. So all commands that you send to a device, while they're pending are in the lost table. And then when they get resolved, if the command times out, right, it's going to go to the timed out table. And so it's been more than 20 seconds. You can see the elapsed time for that command was 22 seconds, and now it is in the timed out table. It's no longer in the lost table. It got removed from the lost table. It's now in the timed out table. Now, if I went up while that device was in the identify command and I pushed the button, well, then it's going to go to the completed table, and you would see it in the completed table. So essentially what's happening here is any command that you send to a device starts out in this lost table and then moves to either the completed table or the timed out table. That's how the system works. So if you are looking for a particular command that got completed, that you pushed the button, well, then you should be able to find it in this completed table. And you can search by device ID or location, or maybe even a nonce. You can cut down the time frame that you're looking for a particular command by the particular time that command was completed. And you can actually go in and specify the number of this is actually the starting point for this table. So right now we have it set in the future, but if we go back, let's say we can say we want to find everything between March 10th at 10:56 until March 22nd, and we specify a time of, let's say 6 a.m. And so you can really nail down a specific time frame for a particular command that you were looking for, and maybe you even want to specify only something that had DD0 in it, and it's going to look just for these particular commands that occurred at that particular time. The same is true, by the way, on the complete page or the timed out page or the lost page. You can look for a particular device ID in a particular time range in those tables. Okay, let's move on to the logs. This is very, very useful in Big Block, where you can actually see the log of not only the turbo's interaction with Big Block. You can see here it's updating, for example, some of the telemetry information for a device. You can filter in on a specific device, but you can also see in this log table your API requests will appear in the log, and your attempted API requests that may be rejected will also appear in the log. Very, very useful debug information in the log file here. Shows you what is going on your particular Big Block and how it's interacting with the devices, with the turbos. And as I said, you can put in, let's say, a particular phrase that you're looking for over here, and maybe it's part of a device ID. One, you can see out that a whole bunch of entries to the log, of which if I just type in DD0, I'm filtering it down to 1,400 entries down there. But one of the very useful things that I can do in the log is put in the word command, and that'll focus in on all commands that were sent to devices. This is a very, very useful filter to use, and you can see over here it's processing down. It has to crunch through all of these entries to find those commands, and you can see here some of the commands that we've just recently sent to devices, and the response, what we sent to the device. There was a command here to do a flash, and you can diagnose those particular commands that have been sent. Okay, so let's move on to the settings. This is very interesting here. You can set here your voltage cutoff. Okay, now this is important for devices, right? Remember earlier I said that we recommend that you replace batteries that drop below a certain voltage threshold. You can specify that voltage threshold, and if let's say you specified 2.7 volts, well, let's say 2.9 volts, just for kicks here. I wouldn't recommend this, but let's just put in 2.9 volts. If you save that, right, then when you come in here and you look at your devices, any devices that are below 2.9 volts are going to appear in red over here. And by the way, you can click on this voltage over here and see the voltage table and see the history of the voltage for that particular device. So, you can set this threshold to whatever you want, and it'll highlight those devices in red for you that are below that threshold. Now, part of the other issue and part of the other reason why we wouldn't want to set it to 2.9 volts is that we have this table down here where you can actually set an email list. And nightly, every night, what Big Block will do is it'll go through all of the people in your email list here, and you can specify several email addresses just separated by a comma. And any device that is below your voltage threshold, it's going to send an email to that person or any list of people, really, in your email list. And in that email, it's going to have the device ID and the location of the device and the voltage of that device. So it's basically telling you, you got to go and address these particular devices and change the batteries in these devices. Of course, devices last for a long, long time. So, if you've got a very large system, maybe you get, a couple of these a week or something like that, where you have to go out and change a few batteries. We really don't, you really shouldn't be changing that many batteries that frequently, even in a large system. Okay, so that's the voltage cutoff. We also have provisions, for how much data you want to keep in your system over here. So days to keep your voltage information, days to keep your confirmation information, your logs, your completion information. This is confirmation, this is completion. These values, are going to start chewing up data on your server. And so you can, keep them to a minimum, or you can keep, a lot of data around. Depends on how much history information you need to look at when you're looking at, for example, your completions, your timed out, your lost information. That's going to be controlled by this value, how much data you're keeping around there. And of course, as you saw, it takes a little bit of time. If you're searching through that data, you don't necessarily want to keep that much data. This is particularly true in the logs, right? Maybe you only want to keep a couple of days worth of data in your logs, because that way, when you're searching for something, the searches are much faster. So really, it's up to you how much data you keep around in your system. But certainly voltage information, there's not a big overhead with voltage information. We encourage you to keep at least 120 days, maybe 300 days or 365 days of voltage information. Because if you have a device that's chewing through a lot of batteries, maybe it's misbehaving, very useful to be able to look at 120 days or even 365 days worth of voltage information for a particular device. You can see how fast the batteries are discharging, that kind of thing. So those are the voltage cutoff information. The confirmation URL here, this is very important if you're using ACKs or NACs as part of your setup to send you information back about when a picker pushes a button or does not push a button, fails to push a button, and a device times out. And there will be another video that talks more about this confirmation URL. Essentially, this is the URL where you're going to send the data that contains the ACK or the NAC after a picker picks an item. So it can be very, very important, useful information. Confirmation security, if you are using a secured URL, then this is going to enable your security method for this confirmation URL. This is very, very important, your SkuKeeper username and password. Remember I talked about how on the devices page, some devices may be authorized and some devices are not authorized. Well, the authorization is coming from SkuKeeper, right? And so you need to put in your SkuKeeper username and password. This is the username and password that you would use to log into ScootKeeper.com, right? So this is very important information, and this is where the keys that, Big Block is going to query ScootKeeper to get the keys for your device. All those devices that are owned by your account, the master keys are kept on ScootKeeper, and so when you try to use a device, it's going to log into ScootKeeper to try and get the credentials for that device to be able to communicate with that device. Okay, Big Block is set up, as I said, with a voltage email list. Sometimes Big Block sends out emails. We also send out emails, and I'll show you this in a second, when you create a new account or when you're resetting a password. We have default credentials for an SMTP server that Voodoo Robotics maintains, and you can use our SMTP server if you'd like. And all you have to do is just put in, an ignore parameter here. But if you want to use your own SMTP server, some customers don't want to route their emails through our SMTP server. Totally understandable. Or maybe you're running Big Block behind a very tight firewall. You may want to put in your own SMTP credentials here. And so this is the SMTP username for a bounced email. The username is for logins to your SMTP server, and the password. This is the actual name of your SMTP server, or the IP address. This is the port that you're going to use if you're using SSL, or if you're using the start protocol, you're going to put your port number in here. So information, this only needs to be filled in if you're not using our SMTP server. And if you are going to use our SMTP server, I'd encourage you to just put the word ignore here. Okay, the voltage email list we already talked about. There are several AMQP messages that you might see here if you've got support turned on your system. So we sell a support contract for monitoring Big Block, and the protocol that we use for reporting data to our data collection server is AMQP. You might also know this as RabbitMQ type of data. So we use these parameters to forward your Big Block information and your performance data from Big Block to our server. Now, you could actually set up your own AMQP server if you wanted to, if you've got these features enabled. And so you can come in here and actually change these features. I'd discourage you from messing with any of these AMQP parameters that we typically will set for you at the time of installation. Okay, so let's move on here. That's the settings menu. In the users menu, you have the ability to create users for Big Block. Okay, now this is very, very important, right? What you're seeing here and what I've been showing you is the user interface for a manager type of account. So you can see I've been logged in as T. Blumenau right here. This is the account that I've been using. This particular line right here is the account that I've been using, and it's a manager account. But we are able to handle multiple types of account on Big Block. When you log in as a different kind of user, you have access to different kinds of information, far less information, in fact, than a manager. Okay, there are 3 types of account. In addition to a manager account, you could have an API user account, or you could have a picker account. Okay, a manager account basically has access to everything. Okay, an API user account just has access to those parts of Big Block that are needed for API calls, right? So if you're going to write some sort of REST API program, you're going to need credentials. You're going to have to create an account on Big Block, right, using the create a new user which actually is behind my head right now, behind the video that you see of me right now. There's a button here that says Create New User. I'm sorry you can't see that right now. But if you are writing a piece of software that uses the REST API, you would have to create a new user that is an API user. Similarly, all of your turbos, because they're interacting with BigBlock through an API, they also need to be run with credentials of an API user. So on BigBlock, when you're entering your username and password, you have to enter in the username and password of an API user on BigBlock. This is very important. And a picker has a very locked down user interface. They can't modify any of your sequences or anything like that. All that they can basically do is inspect information about devices and launch sequences. So picker user is very, very locked down. Now I'm going to click on this button that you can't see, unfortunately, the Create New User button, just so you can see what it looks like when you're going to create a new user. Basically, you fill in the new user's email address, the username that you want for that user, and then you're going to specify which of those 3 types that you want to create. So if you want to create an account for a person that is capable of creating new accounts for other people, obviously, then you would have to make that person a manager. If you want to create an account for a REST API program that you're writing, or for a turbo, you would have to create an API user. And of course, you could have multiple turbos using the same API user account, or you could have a different API user for each turbo. Or maybe you want a different API user for the turbos of one warehouse, and then a different API user for the turbos of another warehouse, that kind of thing. Picker, we would encourage you, if you are going to use sequencing, to use a particular account for each of the pickers in your operation so that they can log in with their own username and password. Now, after you create this account, just like in most systems these days, that account won't be active immediately. What will happen is it'll send an email to the email address that you specify in here and ask that user to essentially create a new password on BigBlock that will only be valid for that user, right? So that user will be able to control their profile, their username, their password. And in fact, that's the next menu that you can see here, is my profile, where I can go in and I can say, okay, for my user, I want to change my email address, or I want to change my password, and I'm given those options here. That's it. That's BigBlock. Obviously, I can sign out of BigBlock with this menu option, and then just click the red Sign Out button. And I hope that this, albeit a little bit of a long video, coming up on 45 minutes, I hope that this has been very helpful for you to see what BigBlock is all about. And as I said, I will make another video that just focuses on sequencing, if that's your interest. Thanks very much for your time today.